right. Well, thank you all for joining. I am Susan Allen. I'll be moderating this session of the Methods Monday series, and it is really a pleasure to welcome today Dr. Daniel Druckman. He's a former faculty member here. He taught me research methods. I won't say quite how long ago it was, but really has been influential in teaching me a variety of approaches, multi-method approaches to doing research. And really pleased, Dan, that you've agreed to join us. This is an occasion of you've got this new book, Negotiation, Identity, and Justice, Pathways to Agreement by Daniel Druckman, coming out in the Routledge Studies in Security and Conflict Management series, just out this year. And I will put a link to that in the chat once we get going, so folks can check out the new book. And really a great occasion as you have retired. You are now Emeritus faculty. Dan Druckman is Professor Emeritus of Public and International Affairs at George Mason's Schar School of Policy and Government, and Honorary Professor at Macquarie University in Sydney and at the University of Queensland in Brisbane, Australia. He is the recipient of 5 Lifetime Achievement Awards, and really pleased to have you taking time with us today to speak about your career, which has been one that has been full of wonderful methodological innovations and bringing various methods together to appropriately address a variety of questions. I do want to note for everyone, we are recording this session, and that will be posted online as part of the Methods Monday series. And let's turn it over to Dan, and you'll see more folks are still logging in, Dan.
Great.
Shani joining just now.
Wonderful.
And we'll turn it over to you and ask you to please try and save 15 minutes or so at the end so we can have some questions and discussion with you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Susan, and welcome everybody. And thank you very much for joining. It's always nice to have an audience to speak to, even if you can't see them. So, so I consider this to be a little bit of a homecoming, shall we say. I've been away from what used to be called ICAR, the Institute for Conflict Analysis and Resolution, became a school, and then the Jimmy Carter School. I was not there for the evolution of it, but I certainly was there for. I started teaching in '84, actually adjunct teaching. I worked at the National Research Council then, and in '97, I became full-time faculty and was there until about 2004, and then had a sojourn, had an opportunity to go to Australia, where I've been now for 20 years, and share my time, and went over to the PIA, Public International Affairs, which became the Schar School. So I did Schar School half-time, Australia half-time. Been doing that for a long time. Still do it, although I don't teach classes anymore. And we'll be in Australia again in the spring. It's a very adventurous, shall we say, life, if not career. But there are many advantages in moving around the way I did. I actually affiliated with 16 institutions. I counted them the other day in my life in some kind of way or other, short-term appointments, long-term visits, or permanent positions. But ICAR was the place where I did probably my most important work. So the book came out. Susan just showed it to you. So it's an opportunity. The timing is good for me to have this homecoming. And Susan invited me, and she kind of pushed the calendar a little forward. I was thinking maybe next month, but she said, how about Monday? And I said, no, can't do Monday. Then I thought about it. Well, I have 7 days. If I can't prepare this thing in 7 days, what's the difference? So let's do it. And here we are. So there's okay. Before I show you the cover of the book, we'll get into this. So this is going to be a mix of a little bit of fun. Maybe you don't see it that way, but for me, it's fun, and some more rigorous kinds of discussions about how the methods were done in a selection of the studies. So we'll see some pictures and we'll see some figures, and tables. How's that? So in the book, there's a word that I did not know, but when I started this project, and by the way, this is what I call my COVID project. Marge and I were in Australia, looking forward to 2 years of staying there because COVID was hardly recognizable where we lived in Brisbane, and it was a huge epidemic in the rest of the world, especially the United States. So we said, let's stay until we have to leave, so to speak. And I said, but if we're going to stay, and I'm going to be the Australians lock you down if they have 3 cases a day. You know, they're very cautious, right? Good for them that they are. So I figured I'm going to be in the apartment for a long time. Most of the time, I need a big project. I need something to keep me occupied. And so we talked about it, and I thought, well, okay, you know, I'm not a fan of people who write their memoirs. I don't read them very much. I think they're self-serving and puffy, and I kind of get turned off. I said, no, but you know, I have 2 years on my hands, and I am of an age where I have something to talk about finally. So let's give it a try. I sent the proposal out to a few publishers, and Routledge grabbed it fairly quickly, sent it out for review, and everybody was on the same page. So I said, uh-oh. So I said to Mark, uh-oh, I guess I have to do this project. Yeah. So there you go. And I got working on it. And, you know, it took me the better part of those 2 years, plus some other time when I came back here to Maryland. Actually, in the end, I'm very happy with the book. There are actually hardly any printing errors in the book, which is unusual. And they did it the way I wanted it done. They pushed me to have a book half the length. I think Susan has a book which is a thinner book, and they wanted thinner books. They wanted to get it out and sell it and so on. And I insisted that it has to be my kind of book, has to have the articles I chose and so on. We went back and forth for about 3 or 4 months on that, and finally they got so annoyed with me that they just stopped talking about it. You know, so I wore them out. Negotiation weariness. They got worn out, and we ended up with a book, almost exactly the book that I wanted. And I guess that's what you want to do with your memoir when you're whatever my age happens to be. So, prosopography. Anybody ever hear that word? Well, I can't talk to really. I assume you've never seen it because I didn't either. I was thinking when I began the project, what am I doing? Is it an autobiography? Is it a memoir? Is it a bunch of my articles, collected works? I'm not sure what it was. So I Googled a little bit, looked around, and I found a word, and there it is, prosopography. So this kind of captures what this book is. It's not a critical analysis of my work or any work that I've been associated with. Rather, it's a form of scholarship, actually in this case, lifetime scholarship, that takes account of an historical context, by which I mean you're part of a larger social science community, and they nourish you, and then you feed back into that community. In other words, it's the idea of I'm building on the shoulders, metaphor, so to speak, of very great scholars from the past, and I talk about this a lot at the beginning of the book, who they are and what they wrote about. And then I'm trying in a modest way to build on and to feed into that community. So somebody after me, maybe Doug, who knows, will pick up on that and continue the work. And I've had many collaborators and many students in my time, and I'm very thankful for that. So the presentation is going to be chronological. The book is not exactly chronological, so it's a little bit different than that. That's the book which you've seen. Okay, good to start off with themes that have run through this long, I think it's 50-some year career when I got my PhD in the 60s from Northwestern in the Chicago area. And I've studied kids in my early career, kids playing games like board games, checkers, things like that. I studied them intensively for the first few years when I was at a research institute in Chicago. And then when I came to Washington, I was thrust into a very different atmosphere, and I was studying diplomats, people on a larger stage than the kids who were bargaining for toys and used cars and things like that. and thought that I could apply social science methods equally to the study of highfalutin diplomats and others, policymakers more broadly, and negotiators as well. And throughout it all, I really, the first thing from the first term paper I wrote when I started graduate school at Duke University, I wrote a paper about this idea of cognition and social stratification. That was the title of it. I was 21 years old. I began graduate school there. I got interested in this sort of the micro level vis-a-vis the macro level and how you connect them. And then I really saw myself being interested equally in social psychology on the one hand and international relations on the other. And where could I really get that? And I found out that the place to go for that was Northwestern. So after a year at Duke, and I planned to get a PhD at Duke, and I was getting married, and Marge, my current wife, also my wife then, said, I'm not going to live in the South with civil rights and so on. You shouldn't want to live there either. Go to school someplace else. And she said, I said, well, where else would I go to school? I mean, I have a nice arrangement here, blah, blah, blah. So how about Chicago? I said, well, what's in Chicago? She said, well, the University of Chicago and Northwestern. I said, okay, I'll write to them, see what they say. Well, Don Campbell, a very famous methodologist, epistemologist, picked up on this, and he said, yeah, good fit. You really want to move? I said, well, I think if I'm going to get married, I think I'm going to have to move. It's as simple as that. So you know, I had to apply, and I had to get into the school, which happened, fortunately. And then he took me under his wings as a research assistant on the project was called Cross-Cultural Ethnocentrism, the study of group ethnocentrism among many societies of the world. Fascinating project. And I learned a lot from doing that. And Harold Getzko was in the IR program, so they became my two professors. So I learned how to merge the micro and the macro in some sense, the meso as well. So my substantive interests were in these puzzles, which I talk about and written a little bit about that, puzzles about situations, which is what I call micro level outside. If you think of a negotiation, what's happening around the negotiation that influences how it develops. And I did this work on situational levers, which has to do with changing little things in the situation to have big effects in the negotiation. And then I studied processes. So Susan, I can't quite see, I get cut off at the end of my my slide. If you can move your pictures and my picture over a little bit, I could actually see that. It's not critical, so I know what it's going to say, but yeah. You see, if you can move the slide over a little bit or move.
You are mute, Professor. You are mute. Professor Susan, you are mute.
Thank you. So Dan, where you've got the cursor right now, if you click on that, it'll change the view of the slides. You've moved your cursor over.
Where do you
above the word insert? Yeah, that'll make your slides be bigger. It'll start from the beginning, but you can click forward. And then I believe you're seeing all of our pictures on the right.
I am.
And what you could do is you could kind of place your cursor on those pictures and kind of drag the pictures up to the top, or you might be able to shift the view so that the pictures go to the top.
Done. Beautiful. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. Continuing on. So the puzzles about situations, and then puzzles about processes, which I call micro inside. If you're thinking about a discussion, a conversation, a negotiation, a dialogue, we're talking about what happens when that conversation goes on. And then the highest level is called the macro, where I'm interested in institutional structures. That is, the contexts within which the discussions or the negotiations take place. And now I'm saying join, enter. Okay, I'm okay. I am not just an experimentalist or an empirical researcher. I also have been a theorist. And I've theorized about 3 broad topics which appear in the book. One of these is about the relationship between values or ideologies and interests. And I wrote a couple of theoretical, non-empirical papers about how they interplay dynamically through time in a conflict. I was also interested in developing a theory of boundary roles, where somebody is caught between discussing things with an opponent and also discussing things with constituents. The other side of the table and behind the table. And Walter McKersey started that, invented that concept. I developed a formal, rather mathematical model of boundary roles in international negotiations. And then the most important work I did probably was theoretical work on national identities. And I developed work from social identity theory and from other sources to develop our own theory. And there's a chapter in the book on our own theory of pathways to agreement or pathways of identity. Susan already mentioned that my work has largely melded the quantitative and somewhat qualitative. So it's been large N statistical work. It's been small N in-depth case study work with process tracing. And I wrote a book in 2006. Some of Susan's work is featured in that book, in fact, which is essentially a multi-method synthesis. And the book did very well, actually. I'm very happy about that. In more recent days, I took on subjects that interest me in an applied and somewhat personal way. I was always a justice advocate, being rather kind of politically left-wing and progressive is the word, I suppose, and never really studied justice, and then took it on, and I'll talk about that later, and also ideas related to trust in more recent years. Early years in Chicago, I was at Northwestern. I already mentioned that. I had a one-year deal at a little college in Lake Forest, Illinois, when I was doing my dissertation. And then thought that, I don't think I want to be a professor. So my professor, Don Campbell, said, well, what the hell do you want to be then? And I said, well, can I get a job at a research institute? He said, well, in your field, that'd be kind of hard to find, wouldn't it? So I said, well, you're my professor. Why don't you help me? Well, I'd rather help you get a job at a university. That's what we train you for. So I said, well, I perseverated on that issue. And I did get a job in Chicago, didn't have to move, at an institute, strangely named the Institute for Juvenile Research. I never took a course in developmental psychology. But that was a name that had to be branded because it was founded by the state of Illinois. They couldn't change the name, but hardly any of us did juvenile research. I stayed there for 9 years and did very little, did some teaching, very little teaching. And we had research grants for basic work. That was the era, the 60s and 70s, where people were doing basic research, which is what I was really interested in. My first project was a very large simulation project called the Internation Simulation. And in that setting, it was a simulation run with naval recruits in La Jolla, California. I was wondering if ethnocentrism, in-group, out-group bias, was actually universal. Did it exist for all groups in all time? Well, I didn't know about all time, but I could study in a 1 or 2 week simulation that went on with these naval recruits, where they played roles of decision makers in artificial but seemingly real nations. I could quiz them, question them, and see if they had this bias. And sure enough, we actually proved in the simulation context that ethnocentrism was universal. Well, much has been done since then. That chapter is in the book as well. We looked at heretic, people who deviate but stay in the group, and renegades, people who deviate and leave the group. We found that heretics were hated more than renegades. Interesting phenomenon. And role effects. Secretaries of state are the least ethnocentric, so to speak, of foreign ministers. Anyway, that was my first really big project, one of my first publications. At the same time, I was interested in attachment to groups. I was less interested in negotiation per se than I was in the phenomenon of what you do on behalf of a group. And nothing could be more relevant than that topic is today, where people have what we call total identities, which get us into big time trouble. We certainly see it in Israel and Palestine. We see it all over the world. Total identities willing to fight and die for an abstract concept called the nation. I was really interested in the phenomenon and did simulation experiments. Some were on labor management and topics like that, and studied the extent to which group attachments were important relative to other things in the situation or the larger environment. At the same time, I was doing experiments with kids. I had to do something with kids to prove my credentials that I belonged at a place called IJR. And with a colleague, Dan Solomon, his name was, we did these bilateral monopoly experiments where it's like bargaining in a marketplace where two people have total control of the bargaining, the outcomes, the interaction. They're not controlled by anything else around them. So it's like marketplace bargaining. If the fancy term the economist uses, bilateral, two people, monopoly control. And we discovered something interesting. We said the best strategy for getting the agreement you want, not an integrative agreement, but the agreement you want, is called positively accelerating. That is, you gradually start really tough and you systematically make larger concessions by 0.1, 0.2, and it goes up and up and up. That led to the best outcomes, better than the opposite, negatively accelerating. You start soft and you get tougher, or constant, same concession making, and so on. We had a number of conditions. At the same time, we did a large study, one of the first studies actually, published in 1976, on cultural differences. And we used the same board game. We had kids of different ages, and we studied India, and we compared India to Argentina, and we compared them to the US, roughly similar samples in terms of social class and education. And we discovered the Indian kids were far and away the most competitive, and we developed a little bit of a theory in that article on the importance of scarcity, societal scarcity, as a reason why kids will probably fight and die for whatever, not necessarily the nation, but they'll be extremely competitive in bargaining, and they were. So those were the early experiments. At the same time, I was fortunate to get a kind of a gig, if you call it. My professor, Harold Getzko, set it up, and they asked me to write a monograph. It took me a year or two to do it, which essentially reviewed the literature on what's called, this is micro, macro, human dimensions of international negotiations. It came out, if you can see the book, that was my first book, you can call it, my first monograph, published in 1973. And I discovered this interesting technique, if you call it. It's interesting. It's almost like a method. And the method is about writing in propositional form, almost like hypotheses, but not necessarily hypotheses. Pithy short statements that capture a large amount of, let's say, studies or literature. So I wrote 70 propositions in a 100-page monograph. That's almost one a page. I don't know how, I got carried away, clearly carried away. So what are these propositions like? Let me read two of them to you. The more limited the scope of the issues to be discussed in negotiations, the more likely a resolution will be attained. And that follows up with, the more resolution attained on the so-called smaller issues, the more likely will parties be able to negotiate their differences on the broader issues, which have served to sustain long-term hostilities. So, and that became an interesting experimental thing about, do you start with small issues or do you go for the big issues? And I did some experimental work on that after. At the same time, the Institute asked our social psychology group to do a workshop. They were having trouble, not unexpected, between the so-called mental health disciplines, all of whom located in the clinical part. We were in the research part. They asked us to do we're supposed to be experts in conflict resolution. Why don't you guys come and help us resolve a conflict we can't resolve? And the conflict was between psychiatrists, psychologists, and social workers. Oh my God, was it a conflict? And we were, I don't think I was 30 years old yet. And I just learned about Herb Kelman and Chris Mitchell from the Institute, and people like that, Harold Saunders. These people were doing conflict resolution workshops, and I admired that kind of work. I never did one myself. So I said to my colleague, Tom, I said, Tom, let's see what we can learn about it. We have about a week to prepare, and let's do a conflict resolution workshop. Well, we did that, and we did it for a full week, and we did not resolve the issues. What we did do, however, was what the representatives of those disciplines could not do themselves, and that was identify with clarity what the issues were. And we ended up and we videotaped things. We showed them the videotape, and we actually pinpointed where the differences existed that were really important that had to be dealt with. And they were kind of happy with that. They said, okay, we have a place to go from here. And I realized that maybe we idealists and super progressives have to be a little more modest, a little more realistic about what can really be done with really deep conflicts. And that has great relevance to what's going on right now. This was the 60s, the early 70s. I stuck to the research grind for the most part, but I quietly supported getting the hell out of Vietnam. I supported Tom Hayden and the Chicago 7 group. I knew a couple of them, but did not do the marching. My hair was about as long, a little bit thicker. But I stuck to the research grind. That's Kresge Hall. You have your hall in Arlington, right? What's the name of it again? Oh, you can't hear me. Okay, you can't talk to me. Anyway, this is where I did my graduate work at Northwestern. It's redecorated now. Oh, I put this up. I was a 25-year-old professor at Lake Forest College. Look at the smile on my face. Look at the hairstyle compared to what it is now. I had to talk about Freud. It was Introduction to Psychology, and I talked about the Freudian stages that you may know something about: oral, anal, and genital. And when I put genital up, I said, oh, what the heck? I put the word sex in parentheses, and I have this strange smile on my face and short hair. Anyway, I was 25 years old. I was about the same age as the students. And then an opportunity came to leave Chicago after more than a dozen years. I did my schooling there. I did my first job there. And I got a job at a consulting firm in Bethesda, Maryland, which is pretty close to where I live now. It's called Mathematica. We were called Math Tech. And I worked there for 7, 8 years and another 4 years at Booz Allen, all in Bethesda for a long period of time. So I was in the consulting world. And I learned a lot. I learned things I had never known before, being a researcher at institutes and PhD in psychology and all that kind of stuff. I learned what policy relevance kind of meant. And I was asked to do some really interesting studies that I may have been unprepared for, but I certainly had the methodological tools to do something about it. And my first assignment was to study a base rights talk between Spain and the United States. And we did fairly rigorous time series analysis, a single case, but we looked at the 22 rounds of discussion, and we developed indices of soft and hard behavior, that kind of thing. And in the process, reading, these were classified transcripts at the time, they were cable traffic. We were operating at the time the negotiations went on. I actually got to know the chief negotiator, Bob McCloskey, at the State Department. They had 1 round in Madrid, 1 round in Washington, back and forth. It was supposed to be an easy negotiation. It was not an easy negotiation because Spain expanded the issues and they asked the U.S. to get them into NATO. It had little to do with bases per se. They finally reached an agreement, in part because Franco died. That helped. And I developed a kind of theory and an empirical analysis of the role played by negotiating crises on turning points, that there was a really strong relationship between breakdowns, impasses, and finding a way out. And that finding is held up study after study. That was one of my most important studies. Then they said, you did a good enough job on this. Now we have a bigger challenge for you. Again, we were in a consulting role. We didn't work for the government. And that was the NATO-Warsaw Pact multilateral negotiation called MBFR, Mutual Imbalance Force Reduction, went on for 12, 13 years without an agreement. And Terry Hartman was my colleague on that, and they asked us if we could figure out how they could possibly get an agreement. And they didn't tell us that they didn't want an agreement to begin with. They never told us that, because these were negotiations that were carried on for what ICLE used to call side effects. It is better to negotiate without an agreement than to get a premature agreement. But both sides, this is the Soviet Union and the United States, wanted to make sure that their legislators would not force them to reduce either unilaterally, especially unilaterally, or mutually. So the longer they negotiated, the less likely to have to reduce their inventories, their arsenals, and so on. But we didn't know that when we were analyzing it. What we did find out is that you had this interesting phenomenon of you had 2 superpowers, the head of their alliances, Soviet and US, and their allies, France, Germany, Czech Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and so on. And what you had is a cooperative relationship between the superpowers. That is, sorry about that. Okay, so what you had was something which we ended up calling a bilateral condominium. So Soviet Union and US would cooperate in trying to find some kind of an agreement and largely ignore their allies who got really pissed off and became really tough bargainers, and they held things up forever. And that was a really interesting phenomenon, which we documented and we diagrammed and so on. And I learned an awful lot. Shortly after that, I moved to Booz Allen, and we did a 3-year study on a completely different topic, more macro level. And we studied political stability, and they were interested, our sponsors, in the Marcos years in the Philippines. And we did some rigorous, somewhat mathematical modeling about the chances that Marcos would stay in power. We didn't foresee the People's Revolution in 1986 when Aquino came in. It happened, and our monograph was going to press. That's the monograph, Denver series. It was going to press. And I said, stop the press. We have to rewrite our preface and tell them why we didn't predict correctly. In fact, we told them we weren't in the business of making predictions. We were in the business of doing scenarios. What if? And we had 4 or 5 different alternative scenarios, any of which could have happened, one of which did happen. So we had to do that sort of backsliding. It was a terrific project. And again, we learned a lot.
Dan, I just want to do a little time check and note that it's all 12:32. So we've got 28 minutes total, and I know we'll have some questions and comments.
I'll move more fast. I'll move more quickly and get carried away, right? Okay. Then finally, I did a project on getting the Soviets back to the START negotiating table. We did a content analysis of transcripts in the State Department, and we discovered that the sensitivity was all around the issue of parity, where both sides needed, especially the Soviets, to establish equality in weapons arsenals. And the Soviets were particularly sensitive. Unless we satisfied their need for parity, they were not coming back to the table. Needless to say, they did come back to the table about a year later, and we take full credit for that happening. At the same time, I won't get into it, we did a whole bunch of studies on nonverbal communication, mostly experiments, and we studied deception, evasion, and honesty. And we found a couple of things that gave away deception. Learning the ropes of consulting while doing what seemed to me, again, I was in my 30s, maybe early 40s at the time, as awesome projects. That's my interview with Imelda Marcos, and she, now we don't get that top. I guess I should try and move this around a little bit. There you go. She said, no skeletons in my closet, only shoes. You know, she was famous for all the shoes in her closet. Had a really important interview, and we were doing this for almost the better part of a day in her apartment in Manila. That was for the policy, the Political Stability Project. Then moved on to the National Research Council, also worked for the Foreign Service Institute, the State Department, for more policy relevant analysis, more propositionalizing learnings, not literature, but learnings from different kinds of cases. At the same time, I directed all kinds of committees at the National Academy of Sciences. I went from micro to meso to macro in 3 different committees on human performance, another topic I knew very little about until I got there. We did a study with the Nobel laureate Herb Simon, who was the chair of the committee, and I was the co-study director with Paul Stern. We did prevent nuclear war at the time, of course, and Human Dimensions was the continuation of that project. And a bunch of us wrote the first book of its kind on the importance of human dimensions for global environmental change. First book, out of date now, but it had many important messages. Also wrote the paper that cited most, about 1,000 citations, on nationalism, published in 1994. That's me. Oh no, that's my hairstyle. That's Albert Einstein sitting in front of the National Academy building. Okay, I gave a lecture in Taiwan. I was there for 2 months, and this was a public lecture, and they had to translate it. Interesting experience. I went to Vienna as an interlude and I already talked about situational levers. Small changes have very large effects. I also did a meta-analysis, and I'm going to skip to that because that is directly methodology. Many of you have heard meta-analysis. The term means different things in different settings. It can be qualitative, it can be quantitative. The essence of it is that it has to do with accumulation of studies on topics, in my case, compromising behavior and negotiation. We had to choose studies in terms of quality. Did they get published in peer-reviewed journals? The technique was designed to evaluate experimental findings, and they were divided by independent, dependent variables. We computed effect sizes, that's the key, and we looked for outlier studies. In that particular study, which is it's a 57-page journal article, the longest I will ever publish, with tons and tons of these kinds of tables. And we found a rank ordering on effect sizes. And to our surprise, group representation, which I initially thought was the key to it all, that held people back from reaching agreements, turned out not to be a very strong variable. But in fact, the way they prepare for the negotiation, the orientations they develop, and the time pressure they're under turned out to be the most important variables. Of course, 80 studies. That's where I worked at a castle near Vienna. Finally, we come to your place, ICAR. And I got a faculty position in 1997 after having taught there for about 10 years, mostly methods classes. Then I branched out and taught about 10 different kinds of classes in my years at ICAR. At the same time, I was also founding and directing a study with a center at Sabancı University in Istanbul with my student from ICAR, Nimet Beraker. And at the same time, I learned all about the United States Institute of Peace. And they sponsored 2 projects, one to develop workshops, and we did that across several continents, and the other was electronic negotiation, which evolved through 10 to 15 years into robotic mediation. And there's our robot. We did this with my colleagues in Denmark. Doesn't look so friendly, but he does all kinds of interesting things. He has facial movements, he has speech, you name it. Fascinating results. These have been published in 2021, Group Decision and Negotiation. The robot did better, in a nutshell, quite a bit better. Got more agreements, also got more integrative agreements. And we found out that most of the agreements produced by the robot compared to a human, a screen, and a control group were creative agreements. They were out-of-the-box, unexpected agreements. Significantly more of those occurred by the robot. We thought that the robot inspired creativity. Our second study on process analysis said it wasn't creativity, it was social bonding between the negotiators. They found a bonding in both being exposed to a robot as their mediator. Fascinating finding. At ICAR, I was the PhD program, so I consider this a bit of a homecoming, and I already talked about that. I wrote these very big books or edited them, doing research I talked about. 5 volumes with Paul Deal on conflict resolution. And the one I'm very proud of is the ICAR book. Our faculty at ICAR, Susan, I think, has a couple of chapters in there on conflict. A very good edited book, a bit out of date now, went into a second edition. We're very happy about that. Susan said she was in that class. It was my Halloween costume at ICAR. It was a scary place, and I was a scary person in methods.
He really seriously showed up to class wearing that mask.
This is my last teaching gig. I had an invitation to go to Tunisia, and lovely people, lovely kids, very much enjoyed it. We talked about religion and other sensitive topics. I taught a negotiation class and just very much enjoyed the students and the professor who invited me. You know that spot on the Fairfax campus. That was part of my last class on political psychology in the Schar School. And there's our friend George. I gave a talk at the European Union just after they won the Nobel Peace Prize. I talked about the work on justice, and I think it was okay. It was well received. Somebody asked me a question, said, Professor, do you think we deserve to get the Nobel Peace Prize? And I was caught off guard. I hadn't given it any thought at all. I said, "Of course you did. Nobody better." And everybody applauded. And then on the train back, I was living in Paris at the time, train back from Brussels to Paris, I thought to myself, well, why did I give that answer? Do I really think they deserve the prize? And I concluded that anybody, any institution that can keep France and Germany from going to war at least deserves the Nobel Peace Prize. So I gave the right answer without realizing it. This is just last year, lifetime achievement at the Schar School with Dean Roselle and Judy Woodruff from PBS. She just retired. We became kind of friends. We're email friends now. Finally, went to Australia a long time ago, been there for 20 years and did a lot of research, peacekeeping research especially. Had sponsorship from Australia to do the initial work on peacekeeping. And we produced 2 books. This one won a prize. And this one just came out last week. And it's called When Peacekeeping Missions Collide, with my colleague, Paul Deal. And but did many other things, and especially devoted myself to justice research. Fortunately, got a lot of really good funding from both Norway and Sweden, peace institutes of various sorts, the Swedish Research Council. For more than 10 years, we had consistent funding and produced all kinds of interesting things, we think. And there's a chapter in the book, a totally original chapter with Steve Wood from Macquarie University on nationalism. I had to earn a living, couldn't make very much with my teaching salary, so I played the saxophone in the train station in Brisbane. And I met Rod Laver, the famous tennis player, at the Open. That's why I went to Australia. I was a beach person. And so I'm so to speak retired, but I have many projects. We already talked about the books, and also just completed a conflict coaching advice app, which I can tell you about some other time, and continue to do a whole bunch of other projects, some paying off, some not paying off so much, with great collaborators, and that's going well. And the final slide really is a little bit researchy. Throughout the work on justice, we've been interested in durable peace, and there are 4 parts to it. There's reconciliation, there's institutional change, security and governance, and economic growth. We did a whole bunch of statistical analyses of different kinds, and we found 3 studies, all published now. Procedural justice was the key to getting an agreement. Inclusive societies made a difference in getting durable peace. Conversion of rebel groups to political parties, very important for durable peace. To get deep into methodology, that's what we call a double or serial mediation model. It's a path. You start off with procedural justice, you get fairness in the outcome, you get good implementation, stable agreement, and you get durable peace over an 8-year period. That worked, that was significant, it worked very well. The other methodology is called HMR, hierarchical multiple regression. It's the bolded column that you want to read, and that tells you how much variance is added by each addition to the variable, to the model. So PJ is important, and conversion is important, about 12% of the variance added by converting to a political party. Very important to know that. Finally, what all has been learned? This is the last slide. Research and applied careers are not either or, we can do both. We need to adapt to changes in the way knowledge is generated, but while also contributing. I talked about prosopography earlier. We need to adapt to imperatives of institutions, whatever they are, while noticing and seizing opportunities that are presented by this institute to further our interest in our research. Above all, we always need to be flexible. We need to bounce back. We need to be true to the reasons that motivated us to become social scientists. Bruce Lee said to me the other day, via Google, life is wide, limitless. There are no border, no frontier. Maybe we can live to that. And there I am when I was, I won't tell you how old. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dan. You fit so much into that presentation. Yeah, you had less than a minute per year.
Yeah.
And you covered quite a lot. I see Lindsay Burr has asked, what is the name of the app? She typed that in maybe 5 or 6 slides ago.
Okay.
You mentioned an app.
Yeah. I will, if you send me dandruckman@yahoo.com, your email, I will provide that information.
Great.
Yeah, thank you for asking.
Yeah. So we have just a few minutes for questions. I wonder if we can step back and look at this big, broad, career and focus in on some of the research methods that you've used. Solon, let's go to you.
Yeah, I just loved seeing the talk, and I've been thinking about you, Dan, for many years, and so it's so wonderful to see you here. And just wonder if you think of this place 5 to 10 years from now, what do you think we ought to focus on to make it as successful as it can be? Like, what's the next chapter for this place?
Yeah, thank you, Solon. And very nice to see you again. It's been a long time, and I'm glad you're still there. Okay, that big question deserves a small answer. Well, without getting into the bureaucratic stuff, over which I obviously neither of us have very much control over, but substantively speaking, I think you need to continue what I've tried to say when I was there and when I wrote that research book. When I was saying, and when I talk constantly about flexibility and resilience, I'm constantly talking about moving, fluidly from one kind of method to another. And when you do a dissertation, being sure that you do some large end stuff and you do some in-depth stuff, and you try to bridge them and marry them in some creative way, that there are these trade-offs between being broad and being deep. And broad and deep seems to me to be a very important theme for conflict analysis and resolution, because we learn a lot from methods. There's clearly a method bias that affects the way we interpret the world and what we see and what we write about in our articles. So you need to take advantage of the strengths of both together. And it doesn't matter what you're studying, and that's been my case. I was always driven by these social science methods, no matter kids or diplomats, didn't matter. And I always got important insights. So from a methods perspective, it's that you got to learn qual, you got to learn quant, you got to learn how to be technical, you got to learn how to be insightful. You got to learn it all. And if you have a 1-year methods class, you learn it there, and then you always had a really good theory class with good theorists teaching them.
Thank you. That's great.
Thanks, Solon. Nice to see you.
Are there comments or questions for Dan?
Don't be shy. There's
Yeah,
a question. There's a question from Nadia about what was the last book you mentioned. What was the name of the last book?
I think it was with Paul Deal.
Yeah. Hi, Mara. Nice to see you. Thanks for coming. Mara was one of my students. There it is. It's called When Peacekeeping Missions Collide. Mara, send me an email. I'll give you all the information on it.
So Mara had a different question, I think. It was Nadia wrote in the chat, but I'm going to type that in. When peacekeeping, what is it? When
peacekeeping missions collide.
Missions collide.
It's Oxford University Press, balancing multiple roles in peace operations, about peacekeeping. Yeah.
Great, thanks.
Yeah, that just came out.
Let's go to Mara.
So just a quick note and a hello, Dan. It was nice to see the arc of a career and all of the different, and that you really did what you said to do, which is broad and deep, and to be able to change methods. And it was nice to see the Wolf. I was also in that class with Wolfman, and I distinctly remember we had to ask you to take it off because we couldn't hear anything that you said.
You did. You did. And did I take it off or not?
Reluctantly, but yes, you did. But it was a great example for Halloween, and I think I'm gonna have to dress up tomorrow because they've asked that we do. So.
Oh, I should have worn that today. Yeah. All right.
Yeah. See. Just a day off. So I just wanted to note something that I had appreciated, and if you could talk a little bit about the role of a research community in making sort of raising the level of everybody's research. So I did not follow your path and combine quant and qual. And I remember some very strong critiques from you from what I was pursuing, which was grounded theory. But I found that incredibly useful. And just so you know, if your ears burn, I do refer to you as the person who was on my shoulder, because I went to you multiple times in an effort to make and to answer the concerns about grounded theory, and to have the methodology that I was using be robust, and to spend as much time thinking about how I was doing what I was doing and producing what I considered good scholarship, as I was thinking about the theories and the other ideas that were motivating the research. So I wonder if you could say a little bit about what you have found as the usefulness of a community in improving research methodologies and how we know what we know, regardless of the paths that we're pursuing.
Great question. Lovely to see you again. We'll have to get a coffee sometimes to catch up. Look, I'm neither parochial, but I am Catholic. So I'm actually Jewish, but I'm Catholic. So the idea is that I'm not opposed to, let's say, grounded theory. It was not something I was comfortable with in those days because I probably didn't understand it. And I thought it was sort of a violation of the research norms that I had developed. Everything I learned was learned in graduate school. I was very lucky to go to a really good department, and then blah, blah, blah. But I very much value community. And one of the problems that I had when I was at ICAR was that there was too much bickering about one quant, too much bickering about that, and not enough kind of learning together. I, for one, tried very hard to have these groups outside of class, and I don't know, students were a little bit, I don't know what it was exactly, but they were not willing, for the most part, with key exceptions, to sort of engage in that idea of let's learn together. I'm a big advocate for cultures of peace. That's a slightly different concept, but cultures of methods, I certainly would like. I wish I knew how to do it better. I didn't do it very well when I was there. I guess we have to think more about that. I think this Methods Monday is a great idea, and keep that going as long as you can, and make sure that students are not intimidated by all this stuff, that if they really want to be social scientists, what we have over the journalists, let's say, over the historians, over any number of other non-social science disciplines is methodology, not methods or techniques, methodology, the way in which we investigate it. It can be very constructivist, it can be very positivist. It doesn't really matter a whole lot what that philosophy is, as long as you're sensitive to the variety of philosophies, just as being a realist in international relations can be complementary to being a liberal or idealist, that they don't necessarily have to be that much different. Can we get one more question?
Yep, Doug, let's go to you. Doug Irvin Erickson.
Yeah, so Dan, I'm gonna have some. Well, first of all, thank you for this. I really enjoyed listening to you, and
thank you for coming.
I'm wondering, because I did my graduate work in an interdisciplinary program, and we had one of the premier sort of deans of the diplomatic history, who guided us through one of our core classes. And I think actually you can come back and say that, the work you did on the negotiations between the Soviets and the Americans, right? This is actually part of, I think, sort of an advocacy for, the importance of interdisciplinary work between history and what you just described. Because the diplomatic historians have always, pointed out for a long time that great powers collaborate to suppress, threats to the system for which they derive their power, right? And they see it all the time, where enemies actually are oftentimes the greatest of collaborators. And so I was wondering,
the bilateral condominium that I found in MBFR.
Yeah, that's right. And actually, great powers do a lot of stabbing their own allies in the back in order to.
That's what we found.
That's it. And so, this is. So I just want to, sort of ask you about how you might look back on that work you did during that period and sort of think about kind of lasting insights that could collaborate to a sort of a broader mixed methodology back into the histories and the humanities and how
Phew. I shouldn't have asked for one more question. That's a great question. It's a great question. And it would be facile, at the very least, for me to actually offer something in 1 minute. It's too broad. I've not actually spent much of my life reading diplomatic history, a little bit, and I've certainly known a lot of diplomats. Not diplomatic historians, except for George Kennan, who came and heard a lecture that I gave once, and I got to talk to him. He was a diplomatic historian. And I gave a lecture on MBFR to him, and others were in the audience. And I was in my 40s. I was still pretty young then. And asked him for feedback because there was a statistical analysis, it was a contemporaneous at the moment. It wasn't historical exactly. My history was time series analyses from round 1 to round 22. That's what I call history. And he looked up and I looked at him and I was waiting for him to say something. And he said, he said, very interesting. I never thought anybody could do anything like that. So I said, oh, okay. You think it was good? He said, no, I don't know. I don't understand it. So could you run something? So I had a conversation with him, very brief, just a couple of minutes. And he said, okay, I'll have to think about how you can do that kind of thing in relation to understanding the broad time periods, the horizons, the world as I try to understand it. And I said, well, thank you. So that was that. I guess I don't have, it's something for me to think about and not to offer much advice on. I think we in the social sciences have relatively unique contributions relative to all the other disciplines at a research university. And we need to be proud of the contributions we've made, but we can't think that our contributions are more important than those made by others. And we have to, this is Maura was talking about collaboration. So it's not just community within the Jimmy Carter School, it's community within the larger university. And that can get quickly out of hand and not really work very well. But if we have more seminars, weekly seminars like this, and try and get people from other schools, maybe some people from the Schar School of Sociology, into the Methods Mondays, we begin to have conversations. So the George Kennan experience, such I did not mention, was very important. Maybe probably wasn't important to him, but it was important to me.
Fantastic.
Thanks.
Well, thank you, Dan. You have given us an hour of kind of a whirlwind tour through your distinguished career, and then you've also left us with some great ideas for current work at the Carter School and beyond. I love your idea about us opening up the Methods Monday to people outside of the Carter School as well. And I love the emphasis on community and cross-fertilization and support for various methodologies and communication between people who are taking different approaches. And certainly something you taught me was the value of multiple methods, and each method having its own particular strengths and its own particular limitations.
Even grounded theory.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. So Susan, I will get in touch with Mark Roselle over at the Schar School and put him in touch with you and make sure he's a great guy. He'll send around brochures and get it advertised. They have 85 faculty members, so at least 2 or 3 of them are likely to come.
Great. Good. Well, thank you so much. Thank you everyone for coming. I'm going to stop recording and conclude this session of Methods Mondays.